Okay, good afternoon everyone. My name is Ajit. I'm the founder and the CEO of a company called Invention Labs. My company is based in the IIT Madras Research Park, just next door. And I'm also an alumnus of the institute myself. I passed out in 2003 as an electrical engineer. And after some years in the US, I came back to India and started working with kids with autism. So I was volunteering with some schools in Chennai that teach children with disabilities, and I got a first-hand knowledge of some of the problems that are faced specifically by children with speech and language related disabilities. So autism is one such disability. There are a few others as well, and I developed a number of assistive technologies for helping these children regain some amount of communication and language. So my products now are being used by a number of schools in India and abroad, and they've achieved some level of critical acclaim as well. The interesting thing is that a few years ago, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, I started looking at these same technologies, these same assistive technologies from a slightly different point of view, which is the point of view of neurolinguistics. So how does the brain process language? How does the brain acquire language? How does the brain generate language? What is it about the brain of a person with a disability that inhibits or which impairs their ability to do these things, to acquire, to process, to generate language? Can we build technology that uses our knowledge of both neuroscience and linguistics to create alternative pathways, really, through software that replaces some of these impairments? The way that if you have a locomotor impairment, you use a wheelchair as an alternate mode of locomotion. If you have a language impairment in your brain, can you use a piece of software to provide the same functionality in somewhat similar ways? So I've been working on this for a few years now, and we've come up with some very interesting applications, not just in the area of language and disability, but also applications of generative syntax, of Chomskyan linguistics to the whole problem of disability. And I think this is probably what we've done is maybe one of the first such attempts anywhere in the world. So it has a certain amount of novelty in the theoretical perspective as well. So my idea today is to give you a flavor of the problem that I was trying to solve and to explain some of the topics about disability itself. So what is language disability? What are the different kinds of language disability? What are the different manifestations of mental disability when it comes to language? And then I want to talk a little bit about the assistive technology. So what is done, in what kind of intervention is done for somebody with a disability? So if somebody has autism, what kind of intervention is provided? What does a therapist do? What does speech therapy achieve? How is technology used in that? And then in the second half of the talk, I want to give you a flavor for some of the things that I have done. So I'll show you a demonstration of some of the technologies we've created, and I'll go a little bit into the details of how we were able to do these things, how we were able to achieve these things. So that's very broadly the outline of the talk. Please feel free to stop me at any point of time and ask questions or to give comments, or if you think I should repeat something in a different way, then I'm happy to do that as well. So with that, let's start. Language disability and assistive technology. So have you studied this concept in any of your other courses, Levelt's model of word generation? So there are many different theories that govern, that talk about how language is created in the brain, right? So there are a lot of neuroscience theories which talk about activation patterns and neurons and all that, but there are also many theories that came from the linguistics world, and this is one of them, Levelt's model of word production. So how are words produced by people who are communicating, right? And the basic idea is that you have these 3 different levels of neural processes that are happening in the brain. So you have the idea of a message. So you want to communicate something. If you're thirsty, you might want to say, I want to drink water. Or if it's too cold, you might want to say, turn down the air conditioner. So there are higher level thinking processes which create this message in your brain. And then there is this whole word selection part of it. So if I wanted to say, please switch off the air conditioner, there are different words here. So each of these words are really activated by a certain set of neurons. So you have to, your brain really is firing those specific sets of neurons in a manner in which it's selecting those words. So out of all of the words in English that you know, or all of the words in all of the languages that you know, there are a certain number of them that are getting selected. And not just selection, they are also getting assigned a certain function. For example, if I say, can you switch off the air conditioner, the word you is being assigned a certain function with respect to the word air conditioner, and both of them are in relation to the word switch off, right? So that's really the first step, and that's the functional processing in some sense. And then once you have that, so that's encoding meaning in the form of words, right? So after you have that, you have to put these words in a certain sequence, and that's what we very colloquially call grammar. But in a more scientific way, in a more technical way, there is word order, there is syntax, there is morphology, there is inflection, there's all of these different things. So the grammar processing is really the second step as proposed by Levelt. And then the third step is the step of actually speaking it out. So there are all kinds of motor the psychomotor functionalities. When I speak out, it's not just my brain that is doing the processing, but the brain is actually coordinating a whole set of muscle activities within my voice apparatus, starting from the lungs all the way to my tongue and my teeth, which is creating the output in phonological form. And after all of that is done, then there are these output systems. So a person with normal speech is able to, of course, articulate their mouths to do that. A person who is for example, hearing impaired and is using sign language to communicate may do it with their hands. We may do it with a pen when we are writing down things. We may do it on a keyboard when we are typing. So all of those are what are called the output systems. So after that phonological coding happens, then it's actually expressed using some neuromotor part of the brain. Now when we talk about, so we don't have to really worry too much about whether this is correct from a biological perspective or not, but it certainly seems to be correct from at least a theoretical basis of explaining how word formation is constructed. And Levelt did this very interesting thing of categorizing various errors that are produced when somebody speaks, or categorizing various impairments when somebody is trying to communicate according to this hierarchy, and he was able to find that it actually fits in very well. So there are problems of grammatical encoding, for example, in people who've had a stroke and they have aphasia. They have difficulty with deciphering the right order of words. There are problems of functional processing with people who have disabilities like autism, and I'll talk about some of that later. There are difficulties with phonological encoding and neuromuscular activities for people who have motor difficulties. For example, people who have cerebral palsy, who are not able to control their muscles as well as typical human beings. So he was able to kind of classify a lot of disabilities according to the framework that Levelt provides. With that framework, I want to talk about some of the specific disabilities that I've personally worked with, and some of the people with these disabilities that I've personally seen. So we talk about the psychomotor, which is really the most at the gross level, that is the disability that prevents people from speaking because of their inability to control their muscles or their inability to control the voice apparatus that creates speech. The cerebral palsy is actually the disability I first started working with. Not very far from here, there is a school called Vidyasagar. I know that several IIT professors and students have volunteered with Vidyasagar in the past, and I was one such when I came back to India. They work with children with cerebral palsy. So it used to be called the Spastic Society of India, Chennai, and the word spastic was originally invented to refer to the uncoordinated muscle movements of people who have cerebral palsy. So typically people with cerebral palsy have damage to the part of the brain that works with that coordinates motor processes. So in the earlier part of the century or in the middle of up till the middle of, let's say, the 20th century, a lot of it was caused by these forceps deliveries. When you have babies that are having difficulty with birth, sometimes the doctors would use forceps to get the baby out. So they put the forceps in and take the baby out with the skull. If a skilled doctor is doing it, then it's quite successful, but sometimes what would happen is that the part of the brain of a baby is the skull of a baby is very soft, so it would create an impairment in that part which typically deals with motor processes. Today that's not a very common cause of the disability, it's more because the baby is born very early. So if the baby is born well before the motor cortex starts developing and the motor activities start taking shape, then that causes cerebral palsy. It's a fairly common disability compared to many of the more esoteric ones. The incidence is about 2 in 1,000, so fair number of cases in any city or in any part of the world. Problem with cerebral palsy is muscle coordination. So you would see, I'll show you a video right after this slide. You'll see that a lot of children have a lot of jerky spasmic movements. They keep moving uncontrollably, and they have a lot of difficulty controlling their vocal apparatus. In fact, let me just in that context, maybe I can show you this video right now. So this is a person with cerebral palsy. Actually, he's trying to communicate, he's trying to speak, but you'll see that his voice is actually very impaired. Let me just get the volume up. So you see that he's sitting on a wheelchair, and there are certain restraints to prevent his arms from swinging in an uncoordinated way, which may cause injury. But it takes a very deliberate attempt for him to shape his mouth or to shape his lips. And you can see that it's actually almost unintelligible, the way that he is able to communicate. So with some training, both of the caregiver and the person, it's possible to establish some communication. And in many of the examples that I was able to see, people with this gentleman's level of disability were able to make themselves understood to their mothers or to their fathers, but not beyond that. And typically when it's a situation like that, then there's this concept of a scribe who helps them to take an exam or whatever. So a person comes in from outside, and then they don't write the exam themselves in a typical education system, but somebody who understands them is able to kind of get this thing across. But for many children with cerebral palsy, even that is too hard. In fact, when I first started working on this particular set of products that I was building, I was working with a girl called Bhavna. She was, I think, in her 8th or 9th standard at that time, but she was quadriplegic. Quadriplegic means under her head she had no control over any muscle movement. So she could not even do this, whatever this gentleman is doing. All of her communication, which was not through her mother, was by eye gaze. So she would have a chart in front of her with different alphabets, and she would look at, if she wanted to say water, she would look at W, and then somebody would track her eyesight to see what she is looking at, and then she would be able to communicate that way. But very remarkable girl. In fact, she went on to finish school and college, and now she's an entrepreneur in Chennai. So very remarkable story, Bhavna. Cleft lip is something that some of you may have seen. The lip is split. It's not as severe a disability as cerebral palsy, and there are reconstructive surgeries that you can do to kind of put this cleft back in the lip. But again, many of the children who have that and who have been left untreated, they have very poor clarity of pronunciation, of communication. The second category is really in language. So when we spoke about Levelt and his systems, the phonological part, encoding, was really the last step. But in the word selection and in the word arrangement, children with some of the other disabilities have profound problems. Autism is given as a typical example of this. I myself discovered autism only fairly recently, at least about 5 years ago. I had started working with children with cerebral palsy, and autism is a very weird, it's very difficult to comprehend because they don't have an outward appearance of being disabled. They don't even, they are able to, if you see an autistic person on the road, it's unlikely that you would actually be able to label that person as being autistic in any way. But there are fundamental things that their brain cannot do, or their brain is impaired, which results in all kinds of unpredictable behavioral differences with a typical person. There are three things that typically are said to be impaired in a child with autism. Language and communication is one of them. Social interaction is the other. These children have a lot of difficulty holding eye contact. they have a lot of difficulty with following social cues. So for example, if I put out my hand to shake, a child would not understand what's going on. Very difficult for them to figure out. And the third thing is imagination. So they are considered to have very imitative imaginations. They are not, it's considered that they don't have the ability to think beyond what they have already experienced directly. So these are the three things, and if you think about it, all three things actually have some kind of a broad connection between them. The inability to communicate linguistically, the inability to have social discourse, social interactions, and the inability to imagine beyond a certain level. What is postulated is that these children have difficulty with abstraction. When I encountered a kid actually when I was still very early to this space, he couldn't understand the concept of a dog. Of course, all of us know what a dog is. The thing is, if I see a dog here in IIT, and if I go home and I see a dog there, and if I see a picture of a dog in a book, I see a movie and there's a dog in that, my brain is able to make the connection that these are all instances of the same class of animal. The fact that there is the dogness, so to speak, the brain is able to grasp that. A child with autism finds a lot of difficulty with these kinds of things. Of course, autism is a spectrum, so there are children who are severely affected, children who are very mildly affected. But for the severe or moderately severe disability, what is the concept of a dog? That's something very puzzling to them. The concept of associating a sound with a word is also puzzling to them. If you think about it, when I say dog, the word dog, as I pronounce it, doesn't actually have any reference to a real world dog. It's not, it's not like I'm barking like a dog, or it's not like I'm making my mouth in the shape of a dog or anything like that. It's purely symbolic, right? It's 100% abstract and symbolic. It's a random sound that represents a specific abstraction. It's actually, the surprise should actually be that we are able to do it so naturally, But in the case of children with autism, that part of the brain seems to have a certain impairment. So they are not able to make this connection between abstract things, abstract writing, abstract speech, and the real world. So there's a gap over there. And for a lot of them, that causes a problem with word selection itself. So these particular sounds which are embedded in our brain as representing specific words, they don't seem to have the ability to recall those very naturally. And we are able to pick it up just by, as babies, hearing a lot of language from our parents and from other adults. That never gets activated in their cases. That language learning is always very, very difficult and very, very deliberate in their cases, in the case of children with autism. I have a short video clip of a child with autism. Again, it's difficult for you to make out anything. So unlike cerebral palsy, you won't be able to really make out, just one sec. You may not be able to make out exactly why the disability is there, but I'll give you a couple of things to look out for. So you'll see that he's making a constant kind of a high-pitched sound, and he's completely oblivious to what the person is saying next to him. So he keeps. So this is a special education setting, a special education class, and you'll see that he'll say the sound O in just a couple of seconds. So you see, he says that particular sound. He's able to say O, but he's not able to associate that with the concept of an alphabet. So it's not that he has a problem with the production. It's not a motor problem. It's a problem of higher level neural processes which he is not able to access the way that somebody else is able to do it. So this is a fairly futile exercise. The person is trying to teach him spelling, etc., but it's really quite difficult for them to be able to get anywhere with that. So that's autism. Dyslexia is somewhat similar as well. Certain neural processes in recognizing letters and recognizing words that we are able to access, which children with dyslexia are not able to. One thing that was surprising to me after I started working in the space of disability was hearing impairment and language disability. So there's again a school not very far from here called Little Flower, and that's considered one of the best schools in India for children with hearing impairment. There were a group of people from there who came to my office one day, and they said, the kind of technologies that you're developing for people with speech disabilities are also super important for people with hearing difficulties, and I was a little surprised by that. But then they showed me, for example, writing samples from people with hearing impairment, and basic grammar is something that they find very difficult. The reason for this is something which I still don't understand. I don't think is really fully understood. There is a very complex interplay between hearing when you're a baby and the syntactic morphological processes in your brain kind of automatically being able to pick out the correct grammar. So they would have a lot of confusion with word forms. They'd have a lot of confusion with passives. They'd have a lot of confusion with pronouns. Frequently say you and I. That you and I would not be very clear. So, for example, when you teach a child with hearing impairment, you keep asking the child, do you want a cake? Do you want a cake? When they actually want a cake, they will say you want a cake. They won't say I want a cake. So there seems to be difficulty in the receptive pathway, which affects the expressive pathway as well with children with hearing impairment. So these are I would call them the category of higher language thinking processes. And we're talking specifically about disability, but disease can also lead to disability in some senses. I haven't put that in this slide. The most common that I have seen is aphasia, what is known generally as having a stroke. I don't know if any of you have had personal experiences with family members or other people who've had a stroke, but they struggle for words. For example, like I met this gentleman who had a stroke in the language part of his brain, and he wanted to, for example, let's say he wanted to eat an apple. He'll say, okay, give me that, I want that thing, give me that, and he would try to make like signs for it, whatever. He would try to say, no, not that, and then when you show him an apple, he'll say, and you tell him, do you want an apple? He'd say apple, yes. But then immediately he would kind of lose that word. He would not be able to recollect that word even, if he had to use it in the next sentence. There are a lot of famous writers of popular books who have got this the names that come to mind are V.S. Ramachandran and Oliver Sacks. These are people who have written popular science kind of books about some of these conditions like aphasia, and you should look up some of these if you're interested, but they're very again very puzzling, and especially it's very puzzling for themselves, right? Like they know this, they've seen apples, they've seen these things all their lives, but they're not able to kind of recollect. So Oliver Sacks and V.S. Ramachandran. The third, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but the third thing is with respect to mental retardation and intelligence. So if you go back to level, there was the message right at the beginning. So if people have severe mental retardation, the severe intellectual disabilities, then even the message is not, they are not able to create messages even within the brain above a certain level of complexity. So if that is the case, then obviously the other processes don't come into play, and therefore there is difficulty in communication. But among my experiences, these are the various kinds of disabilities that I have seen and that I've kind of encountered. I've shown you some of the videos of kids with these disabilities. So what happens when there is a disability? So let's say a couple has a child, and a few months or couple of years after the child is born, the child goes to a doctor, and then because the parent sees certain deficiencies in the way the child is communicating, and the child is diagnosed with a disability, one of these disabilities. What happens subsequently, right? In most of the world today, the political belief, or at least the sociological belief, is that the fact that the child has a disability should not exclude them from access to education and access to life opportunities. And this is the prevailing sentiment. It's called inclusion. The idea is that you should include, society should give, make opportunities for children with even these kinds of disabilities to be included into normal education and normal social interactions and normal employment opportunities. The way by which inclusion is facilitated starts with the education system and during education. So in the 2 to 4 or even 1 to 4 kind of age group, it's called early intervention. So there are certain things which are done very early to kind of prepare the child to have a normal life, and then there's special education. So from the time they go into school, they get into the stream of special education. Today the trend, at least in countries abroad, is for special education to be alongside normal education. So a lot of schools are inclusive, which means that a child with special needs will sit in a classroom, but they will either have extra attention or they will have extra classes in order to overcome the disabilities that they have. For example, if it's a hearing impaired child, there may be another teacher just specifically for that child who's translating everything the primary teacher is saying into sign language so that that person can understand. And then you have certain accommodations which are given to them in terms of taking exams, in terms of entrance into college and things like that. For example, children with dyslexia may have extra time given to them for taking an exam. Even in India we have a system where they're given an hour extra, 3-hour exam they can take 4 hours. Children with visual impairment and with cerebral palsy are given a scribe with visual impairment. So these are various things which happen. The one thing which kind of goes from the 2-year-old all the way to an 18-year-old in the case of language disabilities is what's called speech therapy. Again, this is something which I discovered very recently, because in India we have very few speech therapists. In fact, in the entire country we have only 1,800 speech therapists. I mean, think about it, you could actually fill the OAT with all the speech therapists who are there in India, whereas in the US even a small city would have 2,000 speech therapists. The idea is that any child who has a disability with a language or a speech or a communication problem, they will be assigned a speech therapist who will provide therapy for them. Now, I showed you a video of the child with autism, and there was this girl, the lady who was trying to help the child create this hot dog. Usually what happens is that there is this L1 acquisition, so the first language, your native language. L1 acquisition has to be done very deliberately for a child with a disability. So it's very similar to any of us learning a second language, a complicated second language. Like if we all had to learn Japanese, we would have to be taught in a certain way. The approach to special education is to teach L1 that way. So a lot of L1 is not immersive, but it's very deliberate. So you teach them alphabets, you teach them words, you teach them how to read and write in very, very small chunks. It's a very painstaking process, but on a daily basis or on a weekly basis, speech therapy allows these children to have access to a basic amount of language. The language allows them to do certain things. So this is called the pragmatic approach to speech therapy. You don't measure the speech therapy based on how many words this person knows, whether this person knows the alphabet, but really what can this person do with the language that they have acquired through speech therapy. Can they request for things? Can they ask questions? Can they answer questions? Can they agree and disagree? Can they express various emotions? Can they comment about things? So these are all not either syntactic or vocabulary or lexical functions, but they are pragmatic functions. What is the capability of the child within this particular world? So while the speech therapist is focused on these one-to-one methods to teach L1 very deliberately to the child also is provided with access to technology, and that's really where most of my focus has been. How can you create technologies that allow the child to kind of bypass those parts of the brain which are impaired through other pathways? So what does this mean, right? I'll give you an example. In the case of children with autism, what was found to be very successful, so we'll come back to this. What was found to be very successful was these picture-based communication systems. So if a child with autism wants to communicate that they've seen a dog, they can't say the word dog because they don't have that abstraction. They can't write it down because again that requires an abstraction. But what was found to be very successful was that they can pick out an image of a dog and they can show that to you and say that I saw a dog. And even if it's not the same dog that they saw, that access to that level of abstraction was found to be much easier for a child with autism than access to either oral or to written forms of language. So you see that in the illustration on the right side, the kid is actually pointing to one of 3 different objects which are there on the picture board there. On the right side is a picture book. These picture books are ubiquitous, like in most of the schools in Chennai, in fact in most of the schools all over the world, you'll see kids having these picture books. So these would have several hundreds of pictures. For very early users of these technologies are children with very severe impairments. It might just be a single page with a lot of pictures on it. So it's called a picture board in that case. And the child would pick out a specific word by pointing to a specific picture. And so if they wanted to say that they want to drink water, they would point to the picture for water, and it would signify to the communicator that that's what they want. If they want to go home, they would point to the picture of home. If they want to say, I want my mother, they would point to a picture of their mother. So this is the tried and tested methodology for many of these children with autism to communicate. And you can see that this is actually different from the therapist, or at least parallel to the therapist approach. So therapist is teaching them the language, but in parallel they have access to communication through pictures. So my intervention in the world of assistive technology started with how to translate this picture-based communication into a more convenient, more powerful format on a device, on a portable device that a child could carry around. These books had a couple of limitations. One of the limitations being that, of course, you have only a finite quantity of pictures that you can carry. It's always going to be finite, but it was a fairly small number, maybe a couple of hundred. With a computer system, you could have access to so many more. And the other thing is the quality of communication with an interlocutor, with a communication partner who was not familiar with this, is very poor. So if a kid was, let's say, going on a bus and they wanted to buy a bus ticket, the bus conductor may not really understand what's going on here. So unless there is that communication in the form of voice, it becomes very hard for somebody to understand what's going on. So my initial efforts were focused on using this as a platform for communication. So I'm going to show you, I'll come back to this. I'm going to show you the technology that I created. Let me see if I can give you a demo of this. So when we started off, we were creating hardware devices that were acting as these artificial voices for children with disabilities. But then over a period of time, we started creating apps for devices like the iPad. So this is an iPad. In fact, it's one of the bigger iPads. Can you see, or do you want me to try to connect it to the? Are you able to see in the back? Okay. At least for the purpose of this, I think you don't need to know too much of detail about it. But you see that here what we have is you have an array of different pictures. So there are a bunch of different pictures here, and these pictures have been chosen with a certain amount of research that has gone into it. So there's a certain iconicity to these pictures. Also the ability to make out differences between the pictures very clearly even at low resolutions. And in addition to all of these pictures, there are also a number of categories. So you can see that if you go into the things category, there's a whole bunch of different objects, phone and iPad and all of those things. And the way that the app works is that when you tap an image, it speaks it out. So it's not just pointing, but it's actually speaking. So it's creating speech, and then you can sequence these things together to actually communicate slightly more complicated things. For example, if I want to say I want a bag, so you're actually able to sequence these three words together to say I want bag, and then the kid would then tap this,
I want bag.
So it would speak it out saying I want bag. So of course it's not grammatically perfect, and it has a limited ability to capture some of this grammatical nuance. But this was life-changing for many of the children who have access to an iPad, because they are able to express some of these things which would otherwise have been impossible for them. To say that they want something, or to say that they are thinking about something, or they see something, or they eat something, all of that becomes very convenient with a device like this. Now, the important thing is that this device is not used in isolation. So it's not as though a kid is given an iPad and this app and then they are told to go and start communicating. It's obviously not that way. The way that this actually works in real life is that this is a part of speech therapy. So the kid is given this, and then the vocabulary is graded. So this, what I've just shown you, is of course a slightly high level of vocabulary, but there is a much simpler vocabulary as well. So let me show you that. So you can see that at its simplest form it's just a yes and no. So this is very easy for educator to teach a child, and then you can gradually increase the complexity there. So you can have 3 or you can have 4, or let's say this is with 15 pictures. So you have just the very basic yes no, and then you have some of the basic verbs, some of the basic descriptors, asking for something more, asking for something different, and then a bunch of other categories for people, food, things, places, and so on. So the speech therapist would start by explaining these very basic things and engaging the child in conversation around these things. Sometimes it would be in the form of a game, sometimes it would be in the form of a just an open-ended conversation, sometimes it would be a specific exercise, and then the child would learn how to use a few of these words, and then the therapist would build on that by asking the child's parents and the child's educators to use those words constantly, or to give the child an opportunity to use them, so that the child is able to generalize the use of these things outside of the therapy session as well. So that's the idea, and this can be customized with the child's images, customized with the child's preferences and all of that stuff. So that's the first system that we built. Just a picture vocabulary with a voice in the back. I can very quickly also show you how this is used. So this is a small video of a child with disability using Avaz. It's actually a kid with Down syndrome. So this is a kid with Down syndrome. You can see that the therapist has configured Avaz so that it's fairly simple. So when they started out, there were only about 4 or 5 pictures, but then he's able to navigate fairly comfortably with a slightly larger vocabulary as well. And the speech therapist is prompting him to do various things. So I think he's saying, I want to hear a song. I think it's something like that. And then you can see that the speech therapist is going and switching on the song and doing something. So there's a reinforcement there, which is making that communication function work for this particular child. So there's a song, and that song is playing, and then I think she's going to sing the song, whatever. But that's the way that so that's the way that he's able to convert that message. If you go back to the leveled idea, convert the message into a specific instance of communication, and the speech therapist is completing the loop there by giving him a positive reinforcement by saying, okay, you asked for this and now I've given you this. So that encourages him to use that particular pattern more and more frequently.
Ready?
And you can see that she is encouraging him, even if she knows what he wants to say. If he wants to say enough or he wants to say stop, she encourages him to go and tap that on the device, so that becomes his primary mode of communication. So these are some of the approaches that therapists take to create more understanding of these things, among the child with the disability. So that's picture-based communication. Okay, so a device like Avaz and an app like Avaz, it falls into this category of what's called augmentative and alternative communication. And I want to show you this just as a way to kind of put on a schematic of how this particular process works overall in producing language. So during therapy, the therapist is doing what's called modeling. Modeling means showing the child how to do it. So the therapist is actually doing it on the child's app, and so that's modeling. And then when the child sees that, then they acquire that pattern. They know that this is the pattern of things to press. And then the child develops, a certain amount of grammar and vocabulary, which combines with the intent they have in their brain to select words, form sentences, and then speak it out. So the speech and the speech is being done by the device. The sequencing to create the sentence is being done by the child. So like I showed you, the child creates "I want bag," and the word selection is being done because the child has access to these pictures. So when we put this app out, we saw that along this particular schematic, the app worked really well. But where it failed was to really address that second level of the levels processes which we spoke about. So there's word selection. Word selection was being done quite extensively and quite elaborately by children who have been well trained to use Avaz. But there is a higher level of thinking which combines I want and bag together into one sentence, which says I want a bag. Actually, I want bag is even wrong. You have to say I want a bag, right? Or I want the bag. If you have more complicated sentences, if you say I want to eat, children would frequently pick out the word eat. That was quite common. But to actually get them to say the whole thing, I want to eat, it was really hard. And if you think about it, even we can't explain. I mean, what is the meaning of the word to in the sentence I want to eat? It doesn't really have a meaning. It's a syntactic kind of a remnant. So these kinds of things were very, very hard for a child to learn and for a therapist to teach. So I spent a lot of time thinking about this, okay, so now we've given word production, word selection to a kid, how can we now give them access to syntax and morphology? And I think the inspiration came from seeing how children were, in a specific case, in fact in Vidyasagar, there was a child who was communicating without grammar a fairly complicated thought. And this is how it happened. This was a young girl, and her mother had come to pick her up from Vidyasagar, and I was there testing out an early version of Avaz. And as soon as this mother came, this kid, she had autism, so she was able to say this one word, she was able to say the word eat. And then her mother was, everybody was, nobody really knew what she wanted to talk about, because you keep asking her about what, and then she would keep saying eat. And then her mother did something very remarkable. What she did was she kept asking questions to the girl to tease out the meaning of the entire sentence she wanted to say. So she said, who wants to eat? You eat, and she would say I, and then eat what? And then she would point to like ice cream in her Avaz. And so what was happening was, I eat ice cream when? I eat now or eat later, and then she would say, go home. So the mother was able to get this kind of a composite idea of what the kid was saying by prompting the kid with these questions. The kid was answering these questions using Avaz. And then this idea kind of went off in my head that maybe that is the approach to communication that allows us to get information from somebody with a speech disability, even if they don't have access to grammar, even if they don't have access to syntax. So what if we could make a computer application that takes that same approach to language? So instead of having the kid intentionally select in a specific sequence, what if the kid selected without a sequence and we were able to kind of stitch it together to create a grammatically accurate sentence? And it took me many years of research to do that, and I'm going to show you what came as a result of that. So we developed a technology which is called free speech, and so let me just show you how that works. So this is the app called Free Speech, and again I hope you're able to see it. You see that on the right side here it's very similar. You have a number of pictures, and actually those pictures are the same pictures as what's there in Avaz. And in fact, if you click on this more words, this is pretty much the Avaz vocabulary. But unlike Avaz, you don't have to really select pictures in a specific order. So if I pick this word want, for example, and if I drop it here,
Want.
so it speaks it out the way that Avaz does. But it does this other very interesting thing. It gives you this kind of a matrix around the word want, where you can hook in other words. So you see that there's a
Wants.
there's a who and there's a what and stuff like that. So if I take this word, let's say there's a word parent here. So if I take this word parent and if I drop it in this who location,
The parent wants.
it's really communicating this particular meaning by the child. So it's saying the parent wants. If I took this and put it here, for example, in the what,
Want the parent.
then it would represent a different meaning. It's like want the parent. The other interesting thing about this is that every time you add a new word, it actually gives you a placeholder to add even more words. So when I added the word parent, it gave me this whose.
Whose parent wants.
So it says, whose parent wants. So it's prompting you to fill in with more and more words. And then you see that if I take the word she and I put it here,
Her parent wants.
it automatically figures out what's the grammatically correct form of the word she, so it will make it her parent. It automatically converts, want to wants, So it does all of the syntactic heavy lifting. And you can do other interesting things. For example, there is a little button here. If I tap that, it convert it into a plural.
Her parents want.
So to make it her parents want, I can add more words. If I add the word see here,
Her parents want to see.
it automatically adds the to see part, and I can say her parents want to see you.
Her parents want to see you.
So you can create an entire sentence really by just following the prompts without needing to know that in English grammar this is the way that words are sequenced together. So this turned out to be a very big tool for a therapist to teach a child not just how to select a word but also to sequence the words together, because kids are able to understand this is a lot more logical in the way that it's sequenced compared to if the sentence itself was changing at the English surface level. To give you an even more exaggerated example, supposing I was to convert this sentence into plural or into past tense, so I could tap the word. There's a past button here, so if I tap that,
Her parents wanted to see you.
it would automatically her parent wanted to see you, or I could make a question out of it,
Did her parents want to see you?
or I could negate it, so I could say,
Didn't her parents want to see you?
didn't her parents want to see you? And I think this is actually a very complicated operation in English. So you see that the do is becoming a did, and the wanted is becoming a want. So there's a lot of complexity happening under the hood here. But for the child, it's a very simple, a very straightforward access to language. So the kid is actually able to access language in a very straightforward user interface. So this app turned out to be a very big step forward, not just commercially and within my company, but also theoretically. This is the first time that somebody had provided an assistive technology for the grammar part of disability, and it turned out to be a very interesting research direction as well. I want to spend a second to kind of tell you, because the linguistics behind this is also very interesting. What's actually happening is that there's a certain amount of information that is being captured in the app. How is it being converted into a grammatically correct sentence? So what that relies on is, I'm sure all of you have been exposed at least to Chomskyan models of grammar, generative grammar. So Chomsky's hypothesis, which has been borne out by years and years of experiments, is that language actually emerges in the brain through a series of very simple transformations of certain basic conceptual principles. So there is a theory that he pioneered called the X-bar theory of language. And the idea of the X-bar theory of language is that you have these words, and each of these words has these projections. And so each word projects a tree, and then these trees are able to combine together in order to create a sentence. And then you have certain movements within the trees which make these sentences represent the actual meaning that you want to communicate. Of course, we've been traditionally exposed in linguistics to using Chomskyan grammar for analysis. So if you look at a sentence in Hindi versus a sentence in Japanese versus a sentence in Swedish, Chomskyan linguistics has been fantastic. Really, it has proven itself again and again in being able to explain the variations of grammar between these languages in the form of these basic building blocks. It's all what's called the principles and parameters approach. So the same principles, but only a few parametric changes, all of the languages of the world can be generated. What we did, or at least when I was looking at this problem, the kind of the light bulb that went off in my head is, what if we took Chomskyan grammar and we used that to produce language instead of analyzing language? So you give meaning as the input to a software or to an application like what I just showed you. You're able to take a sentence and you're able to decompose it into the different concepts, and then you're able to hook up the concepts in a certain conceptual map. Are you able to then use generative syntax to reverse that entire process so that all of the things that happen in your brain are happening in the computer program as well? So there is, behind the scenes, when I created this sentence, there are elementary trees that are being created by each of the words that I put in. When I put in the word want, an elementary tree is coming out of that. When I put in the word she, an elementary tree is coming out of that. These trees are getting substituted, adjoined within one another. Movement is happening. Different movements which are described in the generative grammar theory are happening here as well. The A movements, the A bar movements. So in some sense, this is really the first time that somebody took generative grammar, syntax, and was able to convert it into a computer program that instantiates all of those processes one after the other. And the result of that is really the free speech app that I just showed you. But we can make one other very interesting prediction based on the fact that this is based on Chomskyan syntax. So Chomskyan syntax is based on this principle of parameters and principles, which is that different languages are identical except for certain parametric changes. So this idea kind of went off saying, okay, well, if that is true, then without very many changes at all, we should be able to create the same generative syntax in a different language, And we've been having this request forever, right? Ever since we started Avaz, people have been saying, okay, can you create Avaz in Spanish? Can you create it in Tamil? Can you create it in so many other languages? And we did it in different languages in Avaz, but with free speech we can take it to a different level. So if I, there's a setting here, and so let's say I change that setting. So now you see that it's very similar. Again, you have the words are in English, but when I drag the word, so let's say I drag the word eat, so it puts the word in there, but it also produces the output now in grammatically correct Chinese. So you see that it's actually saying the word shu, but if I say, for example, the chef,
大厨吃
so the chef eats dinner.
大厨吃晚餐
So it's able to create a sentence in Chinese the same way that it's able to create the sentence in English. And in fact, you're able to do the same kind of operations, right? If I wanted to say, the chef ate dinner, I can click this past tense.
大厨吃晚餐了
So it's able to create the sentence in Chinese as a past tense. It's able to make a question out of that.
大厨吃晚餐了吗
Right? So it's able to make that question out of it. And you're able to create, like,
忙的大厨吃晚餐了吗
all of the variations between Chinese and English have been really distilled down into the parameters that allow you to create the sentence like this. And this is really, I think, of course the technology is cool and a lot of people have been impressed by it, but it's also a very practical demonstration of the validity of some of these Chomskyan methods. There's always been a big argument in the linguistics world about whether Chomsky is right or wrong, but I think whether he's right or wrong, his work has resulted in a certain experimental demonstration that from the same input and with only parametric variations we are able to create outputs in multiple languages. So that in some sense is the theoretical underpinning of some of this technology that went into the production of this free speech. So that's in a nutshell some of the work that I have done. To summarize kind of the different streams of things that I have been telling you here, there are these disabilities, and the disabilities create certain impairments in children's way that they process words and the way that they process syntax and morphology. Coming from a completely different part of linguistics, you have people who studied the brain, who studied the structure of language, and who created certain theories for how words and syntax and morphology can be represented and manipulated, and that's the whole generative grammar side of things. And then in assistive technology, the opportunity is really to marry these two things together into taking those ideas and putting the cloak of images, so putting the accessibility of a touch screen and stuff like that to those concepts, and being able to create these apps as it were, which are able to communicate and which are able to express language the way that all of us have access to for a person who doesn't have the same language capabilities as us. So in a nutshell, I think disability is interesting for a linguist because it brings all of these different worlds together. You have the social aspect of the speech therapy, the inclusion, you have the generative aspect of the technology, and you have of course the aspect of the brain and the language impairments itself. So a very fascinating area to work in, and I feel quite happy that I'm working in this space. But if any of you would like a closer look at some of these things, I'm happy to share more of this technology with you. The other interesting thing is that we are looking at kind of taking this core, we've got it working now in Chinese and English, and I think it would be very interesting to see if this technology can also work in several other languages, especially some of our Indian languages. Again, Chomsky predicts that it should work, but it's nothing like seeing with your own eyes. So we do have some opportunities, if any of you is interested in in an internship or something like that, where we can look at some of these interesting ideas together, then please contact me. But otherwise, just it's something to remember that linguistics does have a lot of magic behind it. It's not boring. It's not theoretical. It's exciting. It's interesting. It's vital. It's immediately relevant to society today, and the level of innovation that linguistics can bring to products that we create in the world today is really unparalleled. There is very few other technologies that have the same immediate impact as some of these linguistics ideas do in the world that we have today. So that's the message I want to leave you with. Happy to answer any questions, and also happy to show you a closer look if you're interested in any of this stuff.
One doubt that I had about the app in particular was how it's used to convey very simple ideas. Like I want something, who is this? So how does it work when you want to say convey a complicated sentence using conjunctions like and, but, I want this, and, or you want to express a very complicated idea? And how would this particular app work if the child with autism grows up and wants to keep using the app?
It's a good question, and the theoretical underpinning of this can extend to fairly complicated sentences. So, for example, even let's see if I can make a more complicated sentence out of this,
忙的
right?
大厨吃晚餐了。
So the busy chef, let's say,
忙的大厨没吃晚餐。
didn't eat lunch
Actions.
because he came late, let's say. So there's a y over here. So if I put that here,
忙的大厨没吃晚来。
and so I can say because he
忙的大厨没吃晚餐，他来。忙的大厨没吃晚餐，他来。忙的大厨没吃晚
because
餐，
he came
来。
he came home.
忙的大厨没吃晚餐，他来到家。
Okay, let's try. I'll make it speak in English instead. So let's start with eat.
Eat.
Okay, so the dog
The dog eats.
eats
The
tomato.
dog eats the tomato.
So the dog
eats tomatoes.
the dog doesn't
The
eat.
dog doesn't eat tomatoes.
So let's say the dog doesn't eat tomatoes because he doesn't like it, or because he. Let's say let's find the word like.
The dog doesn't eat tomatoes for liking. The dog doesn't eat tomatoes because he likes.
Because he likes
The
oranges,
dog doesn't eat tomatoes because he likes oranges.
right? So, I mean, it's not the most complicated sentence, but it's certainly a complex sentence in grammatical terms. So there are sentences that the technology cannot create yet, to answer the question honestly, but that's more a limitation of how much we've been able to implement rather than a limitation of the theoretical framework of it itself. So that's also an area where we are continuing to kind of work on, trying to see how we can give access to some of these things. So yeah, yes.
So using this sort of an app at an earlier age, especially in terms of, okay, I understand that it works well with autism, but something like Down syndrome, which people actually are pretty jovial, happy, they interact with people quite comfortably.
Yeah.
Do you think if it was introduced at an earlier age, it would lead to a sort of dependency on this sort of communication and hamper the regular social development that a child has?
So it's a good question. Actually, there are multiple schools of thought on this, and a lot of research over the last 20-30 years has gone into whether assistive technology and communication impair speech. And in India, we actually see this attitude quite prevalent among many parents of many children with autism specifically. And even a lot of speech therapists who really give advice to the parents saying, well, let's hold off on the technology because your child might develop speech later, like when he's 5 or 6. Unfortunately, the research is very unambiguous about this, and it's very unequivocal in saying, first of all, children with any of these disabilities, whether it's autism, Downs, any of these disabilities, the chances that they start developing speech later in life, especially after the age of 4, if they haven't been communicating so far, is very low. So to use that as a hope to prevent the implementation of technology is generally a futile hope. The second thing is actually much more important. The second thing is communication, whether we like it or not, is an integral part of growth, and we see this with, for example, hearing impaired children, right? So it's not just that they are not able to hear or they're not able to communicate, they also don't have access to higher level thinking because they are not able to communicate. For example, a lot of communication, a lot of learning happens by asking questions, a lot of learning happens by trying to say something and getting it wrong and then correcting yourself. So communication is related to learning in a way which is independent of the mode of communication, only dependent on the quantity of communication. So the more you communicate, the more you learn, and if you don't have communication, then you don't have learning. So people have realized that having these devices at an early age, as early as possible, in fact some of the users of Avaz are only 2 years old, having these devices at the age of 2 and being able to express yourself, saying, you want this or you don't want that, or you like this or you don't like that, that is much more effective in development than waiting for a few years to see whether the kid is able to communicate, and then if they are not able to communicate, introducing it at a later age. So that's the holistic development of a child is something that these devices support. This question of dependency has also been addressed in the literature, and I think if anything, they found that these kinds of devices increase the motivation of the child to start communicating, and they increase the desire to communicate, the intent to want to start to talk, and there has actually been a pretty significant correlation between the use of these kinds of devices and the later development of speech. So that's pretty much a conclusive answer to this question. Yes?
One, this is very basic confusion. One, doesn't this mean that the child has to learn the pictures in the app first, right?
Yes, that's typically under the guidance of a speech therapist.
Okay. Two, for instance, you said that currently it works with just English and Chinese. Let's say somebody uses it in English to teach a child whose parents speak Tamil.
Yeah.
So if the speech therapist uses this to teach him in English and then he hears Tamil all around him while he's back home, doesn't this mean that the child's going to get confused?
Yeah, absolutely, and that's something that shouldn't be encouraged. I want to draw a distinction here. I showed you two different apps. I showed you Avaz, which was the first one I demonstrated, and then I showed you free speech. These two apps actually have very different functionalities within a child's life. So it's not that free speech is a replacement for Avaz. Free speech is actually meant for a different purpose. Now, Avaz is the communication app. So that is the app that a child would use on a daily basis to communicate in daily life. So they pick out the words themselves, they learn syntax, they sometimes make wrong sentences, they get corrected, they learn that way. And so that's the workhorse in some sense for the child to communicate. And Avaz is actually available in a lot of it's available in all the Indian languages. It's available in Danish, Spanish, French, whole bunch of languages that we've created it in. It's not difficult. All you have to do is to create, like when you tap it, instead of saying eat, it should say sapdu or whatever, that's not the hard part. Free speech is a language learning app. So the thing is that the processes for learning acquiring a language are complicated for a child with autism because they don't have access to the language beyond its surface form. When we communicate, we are only hearing sentences, like we're only hearing the end result of what I'm trying to communicate to you. Whereas actually that is being born in my head and that is getting assembled in my head in a way that is invisible to you. It's just so that the brain is so capable in the area of language that from that end result, as a baby, just hearing that end result again and again, the child is able to create the processes internally to produce that end result. That's actually very magical if you think about it. But just by listening to the output, the child is able to create the mechanism to produce that output. In the case of kids with autism, what free speech does is that it provides a kind of a window into that process, by actually doing the assembling manually. So a speech therapist would use Avaz for communication, but they would use free speech for teaching language to a child with disabilities through this process of visualizing and manipulating language on a visual basis. So I guess that's at least a part answer to your question. But yes, you are absolutely right. If a child is using this device in a classroom or in a speech therapy session, we do insist, and most good speech therapists insist, that the device also be used from the moment the child wakes up to the moment the child goes to bed, in class, at home, travel, going out, all of that stuff. So that continuity is very essential for them to learn.
So interacting with multiple languages is going to make use there.
Yeah, so ideally it would be in the language that they most frequently use. If it's in Tamil medium, then it's just Tamil. If it's mostly an English environment, then it's English. So yeah. Yes.
So basically, like a few observations that I made was when you talked about abstraction, like
Yeah.
how, especially speaking of autistic cases, so abstraction plays, like they can't understand the concept of abstraction. So don't you think it's a lot of like the part is played by memory? So like even when you talked about prompting, like the case where the mother prompted the child to
Yeah.
so don't you think that the child, like through your own experience, I just wanted to know how much do you think the memory plays a role? Like if the child is like he's able to get the logic, he knows what he wants to say, but he's not able
Yeah.
to communicate. So
Yeah.
do you think that it's the memory that's lacking, or like?
No, it's not memory, but it's a fascinating question, and it's really not been answered yet. You see, the very interesting thing about kids with autism, and many of these not just autism, but many of these disabilities, is that so there are two language pathways in the brain, right? And very recently that I discovered that actually they are two completely different things. So there's a receptive pathway and expressive pathway. So a kid with autism is actually very proficient, at least much more proficient than their expressive skills. The receptive skills are very good. So a child with autism may not be able to say that they want water, but if you ask them what they want, like if you say, okay, what do you want, they'll be able to point to water. Why are they able to do that? That's because they're able to understand this sentence, what do you want, right? So it's very confusing. I mean, it seems very non-intuitive. How is it that they can understand the sentence, I don't, what do you want, but they're not able to say I want water, right? So it's just that the brain's processes involved in decoding and the brain's process involved in encoding are two completely different things, and it appears that the disability, the impairment is actually on the expressive side much more than it's on the receptive side.
So like I asked this question because like through personal experience there are times wherein you know what you're talking about, but you cannot express the word, you can't remember it at all. But if someone says it, you know that they're talking about, I was talking about this same.
Yeah.
So is it possible that that's a prolonged thing with children with autism?
I don't think so. I think again, this levels levels model gives us a pretty nice framework for thinking about it. I mean, just picking out that, you see the thing called lexical selection here. So this lexical selection is basically this, this tip of the tongue syndrome that they say, it's, what's the word for that? It's on the tip of my tongue. That means that you are having difficulty with lexical selection for that one word alone. But the rest of the processes are more or less intact. That's not the case for autism. I mean, I think it's very clearly established that that's not the case. There are a couple of, so there are, another class of kids with autism that I've seen, they call hyperlexic. What that means is that they remember all the words, but they speak it out with absolutely no relation to the context. So there's this one kid who just completely, he'll keep saying colors, or he'll keep saying the names of, household objects, whatever you ask him. So he's hyperlexic. So the problem is not with memory, the problem is not with retention and with decoding of these words. And even you saw that kid was able to say O, and the girl that I met at Vidyasagar was able to say the word eat. The challenge is not that. The challenge is being able to recall it in reference to a specific context and to be able to assemble it together to create sentences. So that's where the problem seems to be.
So the other way around, if we just turn around the question, would it be possible to let them learn language if we come up with like different ways of like if we, so basically it would involve the study of the child itself, right? Like if they're more capable with like visual memory or like audio memory.
Yeah.
So do you think that would work with learning?
Yeah, it does, and to some extent that's what Avaz does. It kind of replaces verbal memory with visual memory. So verbal memory needs a certain abstraction which visual memory does not need. So in some sense that's what Avaz does. It replaces words as auditory objects by words as visual objects, and so that works really well for kids with autism. So yeah, anyway, I mean in a nutshell, yes, that's kind of how the mechanism of these things work in the brain. But a lot of it, I must clarify, is experimental. So we know that this works. We may not fully understand why it works or how it works. So to be transparent about that as well.
If that is usually talked about amongst the Sanskritists.
No.
What you're doing is, I mean, the whole Chomskyan paradigm is nothing but it is also labeled as a neo-Paninian paradigm.
That's right.
So if you looked at, you know, towards the things that you showed towards the latter part of your presentation, you know, you take up a verb. The verb essentially is kah, kim, putra, kati, kada, kimartham, etc. You know, it's like who says, what says, or
Right.
who eats, or what is eaten, for whom is it meant.
Right.
So essentially what you do is the whole Karaka theory, the whole semantic relations are basically manifested, or
Yeah.
to say that the argument structure is what is being built in that.
Yeah.
The reason why I say is that there's another guy, pass out from IT Delhi. So he's just finished with, he and I, we finished making a mathematical module. And we've been working on the language teaching module. So
Interesting.
Both. So we've been using this, and also there's somebody called Dick Hudson who proposed word grammar, and Stanley Starosta, Singh's friend, in 1988. So essentially what they do is they just out of the 5 or the 6 basic grammatical relations, they build the whole, you know, the whole thing. So, and again, the problems that I think you will face, and you will realize this later, is that the languages like the West Greenlandic, where one word stands for the whole sentence. It's like, I would like to go there to watch a movie. That is said in just one particular sound sequence. That might be a problem, but for all other languages, and I'm pretty sure this will work, because everywhere where you can throw these questions, ka, kim, putra, kimartham, kati, kada, etc., when, what, where, etc., you will have the entire argument structure.
So you're saying that
blossoming.
these agglutinative kind of languages, where the whole thing becomes a single word.
Yeah.
But I mean, to be honest, Chomskyan grammar does cover that also in a very efficient way.
The reason why I say
It's just that, you know, so the traditional word boundaries may not apply in those kinds of languages.
Right.
But at a sub-word level, you know, with the suffix level, Chomskyan grammar is still able to explain many of these things.
Yeah, right. But
So maybe it's a topic that we can discuss offline as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm not very, I mean, I know that many of these things have been covered by traditional Paninian approaches.
I know also that these genitivists themselves, for
Yeah.
example, Hudson and this lexicase.
Yeah, no, I'd love to learn more about it.
And then I think we talk.
Yeah, we can catch up.
Because there's a lot of things that can be done for people with autism as well.
Yeah,
That's a very nice thing that you just brought up.
yeah.
This is
Oh,
very
thank you for that comment. Yeah, I'll be happy to touch base with you and talk about some of these things.